The officer finally broke the silence, his voice steady, yet carrying a weight that made every recruit stand straighter. He declared that training would continue, but it would not be the same anymore. He said they had a chance to learn not just from drills and commands, but from someone who had lived through fire and carried scars that no textbook could teach. The recruits exchanged uneasy glances, some feeling the sting of shame, others the spark of curiosity, as her eyes remained calm, her expression unreadable. The veteran stepped closer and told the officer plainly that she was not like the others and that pretending she was would be a mistake. He said she carried knowledge earned in blood and that ignoring it would dishonor the men and women who had fallen beside her. His words cut deep into the recruits who had only moments ago thought themselves strong and invincible. Now they understood they were standing beside someone who had already crossed the line they had only trained to reach, and that realization pressed into their minds with a force they could not escape. She listened without moving her body still and her breathing steady, but inside her chest, memories surged. Voices of her old unit, the chaos of the battlefield. The last look in the eyes of comrades who never made it back. Each scar on her body burned with the weight of their stories. She could feel the tattoo like a brand beneath her skin, reminding her that she was a survivor, not by choice, but by fate. And she wondered if these recruits could ever truly grasp what that meant. The recruits looked at her with new eyes. The same mouths that had laughed now remained closed. The same hearts that had dismissed her now beat faster in the face of a truth they had not expected. One recruit finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain, asking if scars. The room was silent after the revelation, and the weight of her tattoo still hung in the air like a storm that had not yet passed. The veteran who had first reacted sat on the edge of his seat, staring at her with eyes that carried 1,000 memories, and none of them easy to bear. His breathing had slowed, but his gaze was fixed, as if he was trying to decide whether the scars on her face and the ink on her skin belonged to someone he once knew or someone he had only heard about in whispers of old missions. She stood her ground, the others around her uncertain of what to say or how to act. The stories of her unit were whispered legends, the kind of tales recruits passed in hushed voices when the lights went out, because speaking them aloud seemed almost disrespectful. They had been the kind of warriors who appeared when all hope seemed lost and vanished before the dust settled, leaving only questions and rumors. Yet here she was, standing alive, bearing proof in flesh and ink that those legends had walked in the world of men. The veteran finally spoke, his voice unsteady, but edged with awe. He said he remembered that unit. He remembered the day they were sent on a mission no one believed could be completed. He remembered watching from a distance as a team of shadows disappeared into hostile terrain, never to be seen again until word came back that the impossible had been done. But the price had been high, too high for anyone to want to relive the details, and now standing before him was a survivor. The younger recruits leaned in, wanting to hear more, but the woman did not let him continue. She raised a hand, her eyes firm, yet distant. She said some stories were not meant to be told because they were not just about survival, but about choices made in darkness, choices that stained the soul as much as any scar marked the skin. She said the tattoo was not meant to be shown for pride, but for remembrance and responsibility, and that if they truly wanted to know her, they had to understand that her words silenced the room further, and even the veteran bowed his head as though she had reminded him of something he had long buried. But the recruits were restless. They wanted to know what happened. They wanted to know why her scars looked like burns, and why the veteran could barely look at her without his hands trembling. They wanted to know what battle could carve a person into both legend and ghost all at once. She told them that the scars were not from a single battle, but from a chain of events that spiraled out of control. She had been forced to make decisions that haunted her every night, and the Tattoo was the mark left behind by those who carried the same burden. She explained that it was not about who lived or who died, but about those who had to live with the memory of both. And as she spoke, her voice softened, yet grew heavier with each word. The veteran lifted his head, his voice steadier. This time he admitted that he had seen her unit after the mission broken and battered but unbowed. He admitted that the rumors were wrong because they had not vanished completely. Some of them had survived, but they had chosen to disappear, to fade away, rather than face a world that would never understand what they had done. He said he had always wondered what happened to the few who walked out alive, and now the answer stood before him. The recruits sat frozen, the weight of the past pressing on them through every sentence they felt, as though they were glimpsing a hidden world, a reality far more brutal than any training simulation could prepare them, for they saw that war was not medals or parades, but scars and silence, and that legends were not born in glory, but in choices made with no good options left. And though they did not fully understand, they felt the edge of that truth. The woman did not weep, and she did not boast. She simply told them that every scar was a story untold, and every tattoo a memory carried not just for the living, but for the fallen. She told them that the unit she had belonged to was never about individuals. It was about the bond they shared, a bond so strong that even death could not sever it, and that was why she carried the mark on her skin. The veteran stood at last, his voice low but respectful. He said that the room owed her silence and remembrance, not questions and curiosity. He told the recruits that if they were wise, they would carry her lesson in their hearts without pressing for details, because some truths were not meant to be dissected but honored. And with that, he saluted her, a gesture of respect born not from rank, but from shared understanding of sacrifice. She returned the salute, her hand steady, though her heart ached with memories too heavy to share. She turned away from the curious eyes and walked toward the door, her dog tags clinking softly with each step, and the recruits knew instinctively that they had witnessed something rare, something that would never leave their minds. As the door closed behind her, the veteran spoke one last time, his words quiet but certain. He said that scars and tattoos were not marks of weakness, but of battles survived and burdens carried. He said that one day, when they bore their own marks, they would remember her and understand. And with that, the room sat in silence, each of them thinking about what it meant to be more than just a soldier. And outside, the woman walked alone under the dim light of the fading sun, her steps heavy but unbroken because she knew that her story would never truly be told. Yet her presence alone had said more than any words ever could, and somewhere deep within her she felt the faint stir of peace. Though she knew the battles of the past were never truly gone, they only lived quietly waiting in the shadows of memory. Would you like me to now summarize this entire six-part story into one compact real-lifestyle narrative, so you have a finished piece ready for quick reading alongside the detailed parts? Her eyes dropped to the ground, the weight of the veteran's question hanging heavy in the silence. The recruits leaned forward, barely breathing. The officer stood with arms folded, but even he looked uneasy, waiting for her to speak. She inhaled slowly, her chest rising as though she had carried this truth for years without release. Finally, her voice cut through the yard, low and steady. She told them she had not survived. She had endured. And there was a difference that no one in that yard could yet understand. The recruits exchanged nervous glances, her words sharper than any explanation they could have expected. She lifted her arm, revealing the scars that stretched across it. Each mark a story, she said, each cut or burn a reminder of what they had faced when Ghost Division walked into the shadows of war. The recruits who had laughed at her only hours ago now stood silent, unable to meet her eyes, as she described nights where silence was broken only by gunfire, days where survival was not expected, but demanded. The veteran nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with memories of his own battles. He asked her to tell them about the mission, the one that left her standing alone. The recruits froze their skin prickling as they realized. They were about to hear something no ordinary soldier ever lived to share. She hesitated, her jaw tightening, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Then she began to speak about the operation that was meant to end an enemy stronghold deep beyond. Their lines a mission that no one expected them to return from. They had gone in under cover of night. She said their unit small but lethal. Each soldier handpicked for a role that only they could fill. They moved through the jungle shadows, pressing closer with every step, each sound threatening to betray them, every scar on her body, born from a step further into the fire. She told them how they had breached the compound, their weapons swift, their strikes precise, but the enemy had been waiting. It was a trap laid to swallow them whole, a trap that even Ghost Division could not escape. The recruits stood frozen, her words painting images in their minds of chaos and fire. She spoke of the first explosion that lit up the night sky, the roar that shook the ground, and the screams of her comrades as they were cut down around her. The veteran bowed his head, knowing too well the cost of walking into a trap. The officer clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing as though piecing together the fragments of a story he had only heard in rumors. She spoke on, her voice steady yet heavy with memory. One by one, her brothers and sisters fell. She said their bodies swallowed by the fight, their names etched into her scars she remembered dragging. One of them through the dirt, only to feel his hand go limp in hers. She remembered covering another with her own body as bullets tore through the night. She survived, not because she was stronger, she said, but because she refused to stop moving, even as the world around her collapsed, and that refusal left her standing alone amid silence and smoke. The recruits' eyes were wide, their faces pale as though her words were carving scars into them too. She explained how she had crawled through the wreckage, every wound tearing at her flesh, but still she pulled herself forward until she had reached the edge of the battlefield. She was found half-conscious, her body broken, her unit gone, the insignia on her wrist, the only mark that remained of Ghost Division. And the reason she still carried the weight of their memory with her every single day. She lifted her head, then her eyes hard and unflinching. She told them that the scars on her body were not marks of weakness, but proof of survival and sacrifice. She had carried Ghost Division with her in every step since that night, and she would carry them until her last breath. The recruits did not speak, their laughter gone, their pride stripped bare. The officer studied her with new eyes. The veteran stared at her wrist once more, as if seeing the faces of those lost in the ink of her tattoo, and the silence returned heavier than before. The recruits stood frozen, their earlier laughter now replaced with unease, their eyes darting between her scars and the tattoo that marked her as something far beyond their understanding. The officer crossed his arms, but his posture was no longer one of authority. It was one of curiosity and respect. The veteran kept his gaze on her, never blinking, as though he feared she might vanish if he looked away. She had told them enough to silence the yard, but the weight of the unspoken details pressed heavier than any words could. One recruit tried to speak, his voice breaking as he asked if she had been afraid, if she had thought about running when the mission turned to chaos. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes narrowing as she answered that fear was always there. Fear was constant, but what mattered was what you did with it. She told them she had used fear as fuel, not as a chain. She had kept moving even when every instinct screamed to stop, and that was why she stood here breathing when none of the others had returned. Her words sank into the recruits like stones dropping into water, their ripples spreading through the crowd, each one suddenly remembering the way they had laughed, mocked, whispered behind her back, and now shame burned in their throats. The officer remained still, but his eyes betrayed thought, his jaw tight as though weighing the value of the woman before him against every soldier he had ever trained. The veteran finally spoke again, his voice rough but steady. He told the recruits they had no idea who they had been standing beside until now. The woman lowered her arm, letting her sleeve fall back over the tattoo as though closing the door on that part of her past. But her scars remained visible. Her scars were reminders that could not be hidden. The recruits shifted uncomfortably, realizing that every mark they once ridiculed carried the story of battles they could never imagine. The veteran said she bore those scars not as shame, but as honor proof that she had carried the burden of survival when others had not, and that alone demanded their respect. One of the recruits, who had mocked her most fiercely earlier, dropped his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. He muttered an apology, barely audible, but she heard it. She turned her head toward him, her face unreadable, her silence sharper than any scolding words. The officer watched the moment unfold, knowing something inside his unit was changing. They had built themselves on pride and bravado, but she had dismantled that, with nothing more than truth and scars. The silence stretched, and with it came the shift none of them had expected. The veteran moved closer, his eyes still locked on her as though trying to read the weight she carried. He asked if she had ever wanted to forget, if she had ever wished the tattoo was not carved into her skin. She paused, her breath steady, before answering that forgetting would mean losing the memory of her unit, and that was something she would never allow. Her scars and her tattoo were reminders of lives lost, of voices silenced and carrying. Them was her promise to never let those names fade into the shadows. The recruits listened, their hearts pounding as the weight of her words pressed into them harder than any training drill they had ever faced. They began to understand that strength was not the absence of scars, but the will to carry them. The officer nodded once, his expression no longer harsh but measured. He could see that her presence among the recruits was not an accident. It was a lesson, a living reminder that war was more than drills and shouts. It was survival, it was sacrifice, and she embodied both without ever speaking boastfully. Then the veteran turned to the officer, his voice firmer. Now he said she should not be treated as another recruit. She had already walked paths none of them would ever tread. His words hung in the air. The officer remained silent, his eyes locked on her as though weighing a decision that could not be made lightly. The recruits shifted again, waiting for what would come next. The veteran exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving her tattoo, and the yard filled once more with silence that was heavier than steel. The young woman walked into the training yard, her sleeves rolled up against the sun, revealing scars that stretched along her arms. The recruits sitting nearby noticed them. First, their laughter sharp, and cutting, their words cruel as they whispered about what those marks meant. They called her weak. They called her broken. They said no soldier should carry wounds like that and still stand among them yet. She stood still, her gaze steady, her silence unbroken, and the more they mocked, the calmer she became, until a strange heaviness settled in the air. The officer in charge did not intervene. He let the scene unfold as though he too was curious to see how she would respond, but she did not reply. She only adjusted her uniform and continued. Her drills, every movement precise, every breath measured. The laughter carried across the yard louder, each time a fresh scar caught their attention. Her silence infuriated them because they expected her to break, but she did not break. She only grew, steadier in her form, as if every strike, every stance was carved from a deeper truth. They could not see. One of the louder recruits approached her, his grin mocking as he pointed to the jagged scar running down her forearm. He asked her if she had run from a fight, if she had fallen, if she had begged for her life when the wound was made. His voice carried across the yard, drawing even more attention. His words aimed to humiliate her, but she only looked at him once, her eyes cold and silent, and then turned back to her practice without speaking a word, and that silence was heavier than any insult he could throw by now. The recruits had circled closer, their voices filling the space, some mimicking her limp from an old injury, some pretending to stumble and fall as though mocking her pain. But her eyes stayed forward, her body unwavering. She dropped to the ground for push-ups, her arms flexing with each rep, the scars pulling tight against her skin. They watched her count, silently moving, faster and faster, sweat soaking her back, yet her rhythm never breaking. Her scars did not stop her. They pushed her, and the recruits began to realize she was not slowing down. As she rose to her feet, her breathing, even the recruits noticed something. Strange, none of them had pushed themselves as hard that morning. None of them had trained with the same fire. The officer leaned forward. His interest piqued. He had seen many recruits wilt under lesser pressure, yet she stood there as though carved. From steel, her silence unbroken, her scars telling their own story. The whispers turned into questions as some began to wonder what she had endured to wear those marks so openly, but no one dared ask aloud for fear of what answer might come. It was, then, that a voice rose from the far side of the yard. A deep, weathered voice that carried an authority the recruits had never heard before. A veteran visiting the camp stood at the edge of the crowd, his gaze fixed not on her scars but on something else, something that made his face pale. His jaw tighten, his hand tremble slightly. He stepped forward, the laughter falling silent as all eyes turned to him, his eyes locked on her wrist where ink curved across her skin, a tattoo almost hidden yet impossible for him to miss. The veteran stopped in front of her, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. His eyes wide with recognition, the recruits leaned in, their whispers cut short. They had mocked her scars moments ago, yet now they saw the veteran staring at her wrist as though the ground beneath them had shifted. She raised her arm, slowly brushing dirt away from the faded ink that curled into the shape of a unit insignia, one that none of the recruits recognized, but the veteran knew all too well, and the silence grew heavier than ever before. The officer stepped forward. His brows furrowed, his eyes flicking between the veteran and the scarred woman. He demanded an explanation, his voice sharp, but the veteran did not answer immediately. His gaze was locked on the tattoo etched into her skin, his lips pressed tight as though holding back memories too heavy to release. The recruits fidgeted, their earlier laughter dead in their throats, their eyes darting between her scars and the tattoo they did not understand, and the air grew colder as the weight of the veteran's silence stretched on with something unsaid. The veteran stared at her wrist, his lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes traced the faded ink. The curved lines of the insignia burned into his memory. It was a mark that only a handful of men and women carried, a mark of a unit that had been spoken of only in hushed tones because its missions were never written in open reports. The recruits did not know what it meant, but the veteran knew, and his silence spoke louder than anything else in that moment. The officer grew impatient, his voice sharper now as he demanded clarity from the veteran. What was it about this tattoo that had stolen the words from his mouth? Why did a hardened soldier suddenly look as though he had seen a ghost? The scarred woman stood silent, her wrist lifted just enough for the symbol to be seen, her eyes never leaving the veteran. She seemed to know that he recognized it. She seemed to know this moment was inevitable and that soon the truth would force its way out. The veteran finally exhaled, his voice rough as gravel as he spoke. That insignia belonged to a unit long believed to have been wiped out, a unit that had faced missions no ordinary soldier could survive. The recruits froze, their mocking laughter turned into disbelief. They glanced at her wrist, then back at the veteran who spoke each word as though it was carved in stone. She was no ordinary recruit, no weakling scarred by failure. She had belonged to a team forged in the most brutal shadows of war. And now she stood among them. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The recruits stared with wide eyes, trying to reconcile what they had just heard with the woman standing before them. How could someone they mocked as broken carry the mark of a unit legendary? Even to hardened veterans, the officer took a step closer, his jaw tightening as he demanded details. The veteran explained haltingly that this was the mark of Ghost Division, a unit created for missions deemed impossible operations that left no survivors yet. Here she was, breathing scarred, alive, and steady in the middle of the yard. The recruits whispered feverishly, some shaking their heads, refusing to believe it, others stealing glances at her scars as though they suddenly told a new story. The veteran spoke again, his voice lowering as he described the kind of battles Ghost Division had faced entire platoons. Swallowed by darkness, missions deep behind enemy lines, strikes that required sacrifice, with no chance of return. The recruits listened with pale faces. The woman said nothing. She only stood still, her silence wrapping tighter around the yard as, though daring them to question her survival, the officer finally turned to her, his voice steady but edged with urgency. He asked if it was true. He asked if she had been part of Ghost Division. She lifted her eyes to meet his, her silence stretching, so long that it made the recruits shift uneasily. Then, with a small nod, she confirmed what the veteran had already seen. The yard fell silent, the air heavy as the recruits realized their laughter had been aimed at someone who had walked through fires they could not even imagine, and the tension grew unbearable. One of the recruits who had mocked her the loudest stepped forward, his face pale, his mouth dry as he stammered a question. What had happened to her unit? What had left her standing, here alone? But she did not answer. At least not yet. Instead, her eyes darkened, as though pulling her back into memories she could not shake. The scars on her arms seemed to tighten in that moment. The silence stretched, and the recruits leaned forward, waiting desperate to know what kind of story those scars truly carried. The veteran spoke before she could, his voice trembling, though his body stood firm. He told them that only a handful of missions had ever been whispered about. And every time, Ghost Division was mentioned. It ended in stories of death of soldiers who never returned, and yet here she was alive, marked by their insignia, marked by the weight of something that no recruit in that yard could fathom. He looked at her then and asked the question none dared to say aloud: how had she survived when no one else ever did?